All right, chapter 1, key issue 4. Last key issue for this chapter, we're looking at why are some human actions not sustainable? So we're going to get into that. First of all, let's talk about what sustainability is. And this is an important term that's going to stay with us most of the year, so make sure that you understand this one and it's in your notes and vocab. Sustainability is using the Earth's resources in such a manner that it ensures the availability in the future. So in other words, if something is sustainable, if a practice that humans are doing is sustainable, there will be as much of that resource available in the future as there is now. So some resources that's possible, like timber, for example. If we manage it properly, we could theoretically ensure that there's trees available for the future to use for construction and paper and whatnot if we plant as we go and we don't take more than we can replace. So that's the idea of sustainability, and then there are some terms that go along with that. So renewable resources you're probably familiar with, and in geography we would refer to a renewable resource as one that's produced in nature more rapidly, or at least as rapidly as humans can consume it. So trees I mentioned. If you're talking, sustainability of the oceans is a major concern. We use them as a major food source, and there are major concerns that practice is not sustainable. That even with fisheries management, we're overfishing the oceans, and that practice is not sustainable. There's not going to be as many fish available for future generations as there are today or as there were 20 years ago. And so when we look at sustainable practices in geography. And then non-renewable resources are those produced in nature more slowly than humans use it. So it's going to take a while to regenerate it longer. It's going to take longer. We're using it faster than it can be replenished, in other words. So oil or petroleum, many of you are probably familiar with this, but oil is one of the fossil fuels, and they're called fossil fuels. You know what a fossil is. Fossil fuels, like oil, happen because you've got ancient dead plants and animals, in the case of oil, that are buried by sediment for millions of years. And then what happens is oil is formed, and it's kind of what they call crude oil. Is like a thick black goo, and through a process of refinement you can turn that into petroleum, which provides gasoline and whatnot. So they're important fuels to us today. The problem is it takes millions of years for that process to happen, and we're using those much more rapidly than they can be reproduced. So it's likely that eventually we will use those resources to the point that there are no more. And so today we have lots of people looking at renewable energy sources, and later on this year we're going to talk about some of the possibilities there and some of the problems, some of the challenges there. But for today, just know that non-renewable resources the use of non-renewable resources contributes to sustainability problems. That if you are using up clean water, aquifers, the water trapped underneath the ground too, if you're overusing those, the future generations are not going to have that same resource available to them. So therefore that practice is not sustainable. Make sure that's clear in your notes. Humans often deplete or overuse these natural resources like fossil fuels and coal and whatnot, natural gas, that to the point that there won't be any left for future generations. Humans pollute. It's a problem we have with sustainability, that we may have fresh water, but it could become polluted. This is a problem that we have here in Florida with our aquifers, that underground water, as we pump out water for home use or for agricultural use, they use a lot of times to water crops. As that happens, what will often happen to a lot of these aquifers is that it creates a suction effect, and it will pull seawater in. Once you get salt into those aquifers, you can't get it out. So once they become salty, that water can't be used for drinking. And I think most of you are familiar with the fact that it's very difficult to get salt out of water. No, you can't just boil it. If you boil seawater, you boil the water away and the salt's still there. So it's not just a purification issue. It's very difficult to get that salt out. So once it's in the aquifer is essentially useless to people. So that's what we mean by sustainability and some of the problems that we're running into. So there's two major perspectives on humans' relationships with the environment that geographers have developed. Two major ones, and the later one is the more current one, and I'll kind of walk you through these. Environmental determinism is a key concept I want you to be familiar with. And early geographers, so this is going back to the 1700s into the 1800s, believed that the environment played a very large role. It was really the determining factor in human outcomes. So in other words, the environment would explain why some civilizations were more powerful than others. So the British were able to conquer much of the world and colonize much of the world because of their environment, is essentially what this would say. So you can kind of see the problems with this, that people look at this today as being sort of like a justification or a way of looking back at the past and trying to find a way to justify British imperialism. And environmental determinists would argue that, you know, what made the British successful was that their cold climate and where they lived along the ocean forced them to build a better navy and better ships. It forced them to, with the cold climate, they had to work very hard to produce crops before winter came, etc. And today, that the thinking on this has evolved, and to be honest, geographers are somewhat embarrassed by this theory of environmental determinism, because it's really just there are so many ways it just isn't true. We can see so many holes in this theory, and you'll kind of see that with the next theory, which is possibilism. That geographers recognize that the environment influences outcomes. It has an influence, but people adjust to their environment. And it's kind of a newer way of looking at the relationship between humans and the environment. And that's really what a big focus of this key issue is. How do humans relate to their environment? How do they do so in a way that is sustainable? Why are some practices unsustainable? And that's what we're getting at here. So possibilism is this theory that, yes, the environment plays a role, but humans have ways to overcome that, and there's many different reasons why societies and civilizations end up the way they did. There's more than one reason why the British ended up being, you know, the powerful imperialists that they were. It's not just environment. So some notes on possibilism, some things to think about. Think about if you've ever been to Las Vegas. It's really interesting, and if you haven't, I'm sure you're aware of it, right? There's lots of gambling and whatnot. But Las Vegas is a city in the middle of the desert. And if you go back 100 years ago, it was just basically empty desert. What made it possible for people to live out there was that you had the rivers dammed, I believe it was the Colorado, dammed out there, and brought water to the city. And so with Lake Mead that formed behind the Hoover Dam there, they were able to bring water into the city and essentially bring life to the desert. So if you go to Las Vegas today, there's, like I mentioned in another key issue, there's green golf courses there. You'll see, you know, people with lawns and whatnot. What had been just dry desert-like environment now is one of the largest cities in the United States because humans overcame their influence, or overcame the problems of the environment. They found ways around it. Think about where we live in Florida and how we adjust to the environment here. Odds are very good that as you're listening to this, you're listening to me from some sort of air-conditioned place. That's human environment interaction. It's a way for us adjusting to our environment. That, you know, the environment down here is quite humid. It's quite hot. You know, the population in Florida really boomed after the invention of air conditioning, and we wouldn't have near the population that we do without it. So that's a way that humans have adjusted to their environment. So environmental determinism is one of your vocab terms, and I think it's important. I don't think you have to write this whole slide down, though. I'm just going to touch on some things here. The definition of it is the belief that the physical environment has played a major role in the cultural development of a people or a locale, also called environmentalism. When you're looking at questions, if you get a multiple choice question involving this, keep in mind, it's most likely going to say something about how the environment is like the determining factor in human outcomes. And the examples it gives here, it says, in previous years, environmental determinism was popular, and it was acceptable to believe that cultures were ruled by their environment. They were governed by it. It was the big determining factor. Look for something like that in answer options if you think the answer is environmental determinism. And then I want you to see this quote down here by one of the geographers who promoted this idea of environmental determinism. It says, the well-known contrast between the energetic people of the most progressive parts of the temperate zone, which is the colder parts of the planet, and the inert, which means lazy, inhabitants of the tropics and even the intermediate regions such as Persia, which is today Iran, is largely due to climate. The people of the cyclonic regions rank so far above those of other parts of the world that they are natural leaders. That's quite a statement. So basically what they're saying is that the people in the colder climates are more dominant. They're natural leaders because the climate made them rough and tough. That's just proven not to be true. Like there's a million exceptions to this to prove that not to be true. It plays an influence, like I said, in human outcomes, but geographers are embarrassed about this because it's really been proven to be false. Environmental possibilism I mentioned as well, just to talk about this a bit more. And again, it's a philosophy in contrast to determinism that declares that although conditions do have an influence, people are varied in their possibilities. We can overcome these obstacles, like I said before about like Las Vegas and whatnot. We can adapt to various environments. So it's just a different way of thinking about the world, that humans are capable of many different things, and there are many different outcomes, and the environment just plays a role, but not a central role in that. Now, just touching on some other things before we wrap up this chapter. One of the key ideas is understanding scale, right? I said there's map scale and there's scale of analysis. So scale could mean the spatial extent of something, so like what level it's at, how much it's spread out. It could mean looking at something at the local, regional, and national levels, and that if we change the scale on something, we can zoom in or zoom out on it. So in other words, I mentioned this example earlier, that if we were looking at crime statistics, we could look at them at the local level, at the regional level, or at the national level, and that is changing the scale of analysis. Guarantee the AP exam will have something on scale of analysis. They will. And then this other term down here, to rescale, means to use scale politically, to make a local issue a national one, or raise an issue or awareness. So if something happens locally, it can change things on a global scale. So think about with protests and whatnot, maybe something happens in one city that makes this a national discussion. And if you follow the news, there's lots of examples of this all the time. Something happens in one city that makes people more aware of something that might be a problem at the national level. Now, lastly, when you read your textbook and you get to key issue 4, it gives out lots of examples of humans interacting with and modifying their environment. A common one that you'll read about that's used in geography is the Netherlands. So the Netherlands is a country in Northern Europe. If you've heard of the Dutch before, the Dutch are people from the Netherlands. If you've heard of Holland, Holland is a region within the Netherlands. Big city there's Amsterdam, you probably heard of. So the Netherlands is an interesting place because it's at the delta of a river, which means that it's where the river meets the North Sea, meets the ocean. The Netherlands is close to the United Kingdom, if you're familiar with that on the map. So you have the Rhine River flows from south to north and empties into the North Sea. And the Dutch settled there thousands of years ago because it was very good farming due to that rich soil. The problem that they have, that you often see anytime you've got a river meeting an ocean, is flooding is a major problem. And what the Dutch did was to essentially build a series of walls and dikes to keep the ocean water and keep the flood waters from overtaking their farmland. And they ran into some issues that when they built those those walls around their land, the land would actually sink. And we've seen this in places like New Orleans. New Orleans is on the Mississippi River Delta. It's the same scenario, where you have the city right on the Gulf of Mexico, where the Mississippi River reaches the Gulf of Mexico. And New Orleans has the same thing, where they've built a series of levees which function basically the same way. It's walls to keep out the water. And over time, New Orleans has actually sunk. It's below sea level. So if those walls weren't there, it floods. And this is what happened in New Orleans years ago with Hurricane Katrina, is that Hurricane Katrina, those walls broke, and the amount of water that the hurricane brought in with it flooded it, and it won't flow out. As opposed to Tampa Bay, if we get hit by a hurricane, that water will eventually drain away because we are slightly above sea level. It will go away eventually. But with New Orleans, it was different. And the Netherlands have constantly lived with the threat of flooding and have been modifying the environment and have been very advanced in their techniques. They try to use methods to make sure that the environment is taken into consideration when modifying the lands. So for example, they talked about, one of the ideas was to completely dam the Rhine River where it met the ocean to prevent flooding when big storms came in, like storm surge. But people were worried that if they did that, the fish that depend upon that estuary, some fish, they'll live their whole lives in freshwater and then go out into the saltwater to reproduce, and vice versa. If you build a dam there, it changes that ecosystem from being salt or brackish to being a freshwater one. And so they decided, that the Netherlands decided to make it so they actually have a movable barrier. They have the doors that come in, huge giant gates essentially, that close off the mouth of the Rhine River to the North Sea. They can close that during major storms. So that would be a lot like, instead of the just the Skyway Bridge, if we could close that off to the outside. That's what they've done. It's been pretty amazing. Contrast that with the Florida Everglades. And the Florida Everglades have been really a disaster in Florida. Americans have effectively cut off the massive flow of fresh water that starting from around Orlando, and some of you may be familiar with the fact that where Disney World is built, that a lot of that was swampland that's been drained. And for the roads that we've built across, if you've been across 75, what they call Alligator Alley, that essentially stopped the flow of water. That you can think of Central Florida southward as a slow-moving river. Everglades is really called the River of Grass. It's a slow, very slow-moving river. And all the roads that we've built across, all the development, all the draining, a lot of that land has been drained for sugar production, sugarcane production, and other things. And that has essentially stopped this river, and it's cut off the Everglades, and it's really hurt that region, that unique ecosystem. And so think about how the Netherlands worked with their environment, and how in the United States, it's been more of like dominating and trying to conquer, and we've been paying we've been dealing with big problems ever since doing that. So here you can see, like what I was talking about, these are those big gates that will close to stop the sea from flooding, to stop the sea from flooding this river and flooding towns within the Netherlands. So these are big gates that'll swing over to close it. It's pretty amazing. And then with the Everglades, you can kind of see this. There's been a movement in the past few years to restore the flow of the Everglades. Like, this is originally how it went, that from starting around Orlando, you had this natural flow of water, and it brought nutrients with it. It's actually what helps to feed nutrients to the coral reefs of the Florida Keys, and that's been cut off. And what they're trying to do now, there's been a big movement to try to restore that flow as naturally as possible. So that's what's happening with the Florida Everglades. They talk about in your textbook, they don't use this example, they use California, and something that we've talked a little bit about in class, the aquifers there being overused for agriculture. So, but again, it's kind of different ways that humans interact with their environment. One, I think you could argue that the Netherlands method is a bit more sustainable than what we see here. That's it for Key Issue 4. Congrats on being done with the first chapter.